The first couple of paragraphs from Signs of the Times isn't directly related to the presentations. It's just a reference to Nehemiah. Um, my son and I here at our ministry, at the newsletter article where people can respond and from different sources, we get a lot of, not a lot, but we get some flack from people that professedly, sometimes they're sympathetic professedly, sometimes they're open enemies of what we're doing. And this passage is about Nehemiah and Sanballat, Tobiah, and their confederates that were opposing the work of Nehemiah. And Sister White clearly says it's a story of Nehemiah as an illustration of the end of the world. So for those people that are spending their time worrying about what Future for America may or may not be doing or the message they're sharing, I just raise the question: we're not seeking out uh, your ministry, trying to correct your ministry if you have a ministry. We're not seeking out to correct any of that. So who's who in this end time scenario? And with that, I give a mild counsel for the people that are doing this Zoom meeting, both in Canada and the United States. And I don't really know how you manage a Zoom meeting, but time is too short. If you know that there's people on these Zoom meetings that are not really sympathetic to what's being studied, you should mute them or block them. But that's what Nehemiah did. There were people in his day and age that wanted to work with him, and he knew their heart wasn't in the work, and he refused to have them get up on the wall and work with him. And I believe we're that close to the end. So I just thought I'm starting that off, and now I'll leave it alone. In under the principle of Jesus illustrating the beginning and the ending, in Revelation 22, verse 9 and 10, you have the statement, seal not the sayings of the prophecy of this book, for the time is at hand. And then verse 10 says, he that is unjust, let him be unjust still. And that teaches us, it instructs us that just before the close of probation, there's prophecy in the book of Daniel, in the book of Revelation, that is going to be unsealed. And the marker for it is the phrase, the time is at hand. And then in the first few verses of chapter 1, the beginning of Revelation, you have the same phrase, the time is at hand. And it follows the opening verses of Revelation, where it says the revelation of Jesus Christ, which the Father gave to Jesus, which he gave to Gabriel, which he gave to John the Revelator, to show him things that were soon come to pass, for the time is at hand. So the beginning and the ending of the book of Revelation references the unsealing of a prophecy at a certain point in history. And in the context of Revelation, you're going to label what that prophecy is that is unsealed. It's the revelation of Jesus Christ. And I'm submitting that the overall theme of the revelation of Jesus Christ is the work of Christ combining his divinity with our humanity. And in Revelation chapter 1, we see a sequence set forth where the divine Father gives a message to the Son, who is also divine, but the Son has taken on himself the nature of his creation. He's taken upon himself the nature of man, but he's still divine. And the Son takes that message from the divine Father, and he gives it to one of his creation that has never sinned, one of the angels, Gabriel, I'm pointing to in this case. And you're seeing it, a descent of how this message comes into history when the time is at hand. And you're also seeing an illustration of what the theme of this message is. It's the combination of humanity with divinity. The fourth step is when the message gets to the sinner, John the Revelator, who was born of the first Adam, uh, encumbered by all the the things that the first Adam hands down to mankind. And we see in this revelation of Jesus Christ, the divine Father gives the message to the divine and human Son, who gives it to a sinless creation, who gives it to a creation that is a sinner. And then John sends that message to the churches that are in Asia, which represent all the churches in the world. And I'm submitting to you that the message that's being sent now is that message, and that to not recognize that it has to do with the combination of humanity and divinity is to miss the primary theme of the revelation of Jesus Christ. Jesus is the Word, and by him all things were created, and the Bible is the Word, but the Bible was written by fallen men that were of the family of the first Adam. So the Bible is a combination of divinity and humanity, and Jesus is a combination of divinity and humanity. And the Word that came down from the Father to the Son to Gabriel to John to the seven churches carries with it this symbolism, this representation of the combination of humanity with divinity, which is, in the terms of where we're at today, it is the sealing of the 144,000. For Enoch reached that state, Elijah reached that state, others may have reached that state that is represented by the 144,000. But this is the climax of the gospel, and there's going to be a group of people that reach that state, and the sealing of those people is a very detailed description. The more lines of prophecy that the line of the tribe of Judah opens up for us, the step-by-step process of the sealing of the 144,000 is very detailed. And before we get directly into the notes, I want to go to Ezekiel 37. You can turn there if you want. I'm just going to give an overview of it. I hope that we're semi-familiar with it. There's the first several verses. Ezekiel's taken to a valley of dead, dry bones. He's asked if he knows if these bones can live. And Ezekiel says, "Thou knowest, Lord." He's not going to make a claim whether they can live or not. And then the Lord leads him to proclaim two prophecies. The first one brings the bones together, but they're not alive. They're formed. And then the second one brings them to life. And it's the message of the four winds that brings them to life. And this being formed and brought to life is based upon the story of Adam, who was formed out of the dust of the earth, and then the Lord breathed into him the breath of life. So Ezekiel 37 is speaking, as all the prophets are, about God's people at the end of the world that are dead, and they get brought back to life. And what Ezekiel adds to the mix is that it's the message of Islam that awakens them, because Islam is the message of the four winds. But the chapter doesn't end there. It immediately goes into another illustration where Ezekiel's told to take two sticks, one for the northern kingdom and one for the southern kingdom, and join the two sticks. And then the Lord instructs Ezekiel that when he does this thing, the people are going to ask him, "What meanest thou by the joining of these two sticks?" And the conclusion is that when these two sticks are joined, they're going to cease to be two nations, and they're going to become one nation. And the Lord intended to join the two sticks in the history of the Millerites from 1844 to 1863, but the Millerites rebelled, and therefore that joining of the two sticks, which is an illustration of the sealing of the 144,000, which is an illustration of the combination of divinity and humanity, was put off until our generation. And after Ezekiel gives the illustration of joining the two sticks. In verse 23, he says, neither shall they defile themselves anymore with their idols, nor with their detestable thing. This one nation that's created by the two sticks is the 144,000, because they're a nation now that is not going to ever sin again. They've fully overcome sin. And then in verse 24, they're going to have one king over them, and it's going to be David. And David the king is a symbol that connects with the 144,000 in their sealing. But I just want you to see that it is a component of Ezekiel's testimony in chapter 37. And in verse 26, he says he's going to make a covenant of peace with them. So the final covenant is the covenant that is made with the 144,000. Sister White has a statement where she says, in the last days of Earth's history, God will renew his covenant with his commandment-keeping people. And in those last few verses, the emphasis is that when he takes these two sticks and combines them, thus creating one nation, which is the 144,000 that will not sin anymore, and he places a king over them, which is Christ, as King David, and he makes a covenant with them, then he also is going to place his sanctuary in the midst of them forever. Okay, they're going to get tied in, they're going to be connected with his sanctuary forever. So what I'm saying is Ezekiel 37 isn't a series of 3 or 4 prophetic illustrations. It's one complete package. It's identifying what awakens the dead, dry bones. And if you go to Revelation chapter 11, you'll see God's people at the end of the world are dead. They're lying in the street. They've been murdered by the beast from the bottomless pit, which is atheism, which in our day and age is political wokeism or religious wokeism. And in verse 11 of chapter 11, it says, after 3 days and a half, the spirit of life from God entered into them, and they stood upon their feet, and great fear fell upon them which saw them. The prophecy that brings the spirit in them, that has them stand upon their feet, is the prophecy of the 4 winds. It's the prophecy of Islam. And prior to them standing up in verses 9 and 10, the whole world had been rejoicing because, okay, we just got back online. What did you hear last?
The whole world was rejoicing.
Pardon me?
Where you said the whole world was rejoicing at the death of the...
Okay, we were still in Revelation 11. Okay, we got that far. Daniel's mourning for 21 days, and I'm identifying the 21 days of his mourning as the 3.5 days that they're dead in the street, because that's what you do when someone's dead. You're mourning them. When they stand on their feet, it's the message of Islam that causes them to stand up on their feet. That's the message of Ezekiel that comes from the 4 winds. There's a message that precedes that where they are formed, they're gathered. It's a 2-step process illustrated by Ezekiel. Other prophetic lines identify more than 2 steps, and it's our responsibility as student of prophecies to align those steps. But in verse 12 of chapter 11 of Revelation, this army that stands up hears a voice from heaven saying unto them, come up hither. And they ascended to heaven in a cloud, and their enemies beheld them. And this is the ensign being lifted up, and the other lines of prophecy tell us that the ensign of the 144,000 is lifted up at the Sunday law. And in verse 13, it says, at the same hour, there was a great earthquake. And we know that the French Revolution fulfilled Revelation 11. And the great earthquake was the French Revolution, and a tenth part of the city was destroyed. And France was 1/10 of the 10 nations that made up the former Roman Empire, and it was overthrown by the French Revolution. And the history of the French Revolution and Revelation 11 is pointing forward to the overthrow of the United States at the Sunday Law, the United States being the premier king of the 10 kings of Revelation 17. And it gets overthrown in the hour of the great earthquake. And a 10th part of the city fell. And in the earthquake, there was slain of men 7,000, and the remnant were affrighted and gave glory to the God of heaven. And then it says, immediately the second woe is past, and behold, the third woe cometh quickly. Right there in the hour of the Sunday Law, when the ensign is lifted up in Revelation 11, you're finding a second witness to Ezekiel's testimony of the four winds being what raises them up as a mighty army, because the third woe is Islam. And the third woe is also the seventh trumpet. And the very next verse says, and the seventh angel sounded, and there were great voices in heaven saying, the kingdoms of the world are become the kingdoms of our Lord. So in Revelation 11, you've got a sequence of events that allows you to lay over the top of it Ezekiel 37, and it's describing the role of the message of Islam in raising up the 144,000. And when you get to Daniel chapter 10, you find I'll just go there now. If you go to your notes, the first quote after the ones about Nehemiah says, the book that was sealed is not the revelation, but that portion of the prophecy of Daniel relating to the last days. The angel commanded, but thou, O Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book even to the time of the end. There's a portion in the book of Daniel that is sealed up to the last days, and the last days is the last days. The portion in the book of Daniel that related to the last days is the revelation of Jesus Christ, which is unsealed just before probation closes, because the time is at hand. The books of Daniel and Revelation are the same book. So when Sister White pinpoints that what is unsealed at this time in the last days, she points, if you're a careful student, she points to verse 40 of Daniel 11, because the story is about the sealing of the 144,000. And verse 41 of Daniel 11 is the Sunday Law. And those people that receive the seal of God receive it before the Sunday Law. They get lifted up as an ensign at the Sunday Law, and they have the seal impressed upon them before the Sunday Law. There's a statement we often use where it says the world can only be warned by seeing men and women with the seal of God during the crisis of the Sunday Law. And I'm paraphrasing that, but that's exactly what the long paragraph says. The warning message that comes at the Sunday Law is the people that have the seal of God, and they have to have the seal of God before the test arrives. So the portion of the book of Daniel that relates to the last days and the sealing of the 144,000 is verse 40, but we know that verse 40 was fulfilled at the time of the end in 1989. And verse 40, the fulfillment of the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989, verse 40 actually possesses a blank area from 1989 until verse 41 in the Sunday Law. And what I'm hoping you're following my logic here. Verse 40 starts in 1798, and it ends its testimony with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989. But verse 41 is the Sunday Law. So there is a history from 1989 until the Sunday law that's in verse 40 that is sealed up. You can't see it. It's hidden. And Sister White says, the book that was sealed is not the revelation, but that portion of the prophecy of Daniel relating to the last days. That portion of the prophecy of Daniel that relates to the last days is the history from 1989 until the Sunday law. So when we get to Daniel chapter 10, and Daniel is just another line that agrees with the two witnesses that are dead in the street for 3.5 days, or Ezekiel's dead dry bones, and Daniel is mourning for 21 days. We're told that Daniel, in the first verse of chapter 10 of the book of Daniel, that he has understanding of the vision and the thing. And a careful study of the thing and the vision identifies that the thing is the 2520 and the vision is the 2300 years. The thing is the vision of the Hiddekel River. The vision is the vision of the Ulai River. One of them is the external prophetic testimony. The other is the internal prophetic testimony. They're the two golden pipes that come down out of heaven. They're illustrated so many ways in this dualism that it gets really redundant to lay them all out. But the first thing we're told about Daniel in Daniel chapter 10 is he represents the people at the end of the world that have understanding of both these visions. And what I'm going to try to expose for us here this morning is that in verse 10 of Daniel chapter 11, that the fortress, that word fortress there, is the key that identifies both of these visions. And they're identified from verses 11 through 15. And they fit into that hidden history of verse 40. And they are what is being unsealed. And it is the message that seals the 144,000. But it takes a little bit of legwork to put that in place. But it's worth the trouble to walk through that legwork. So that's where we're going to head at this point in time. You have in your notes the next quote from Manuscript Releases number 13, page 394. We have no time to lose. Troublous times are before us. The world is stirred with the spirit of war. Soon the scenes of trouble spoken of in the prophecies will take place. The prophecy in the 11th of Daniel has nearly reached its complete fulfillment. Much of the history that has taken place in fulfillment of this prophecy will be repeated. It can be demonstrated that every verse in Daniel 11 is repeated in the last 6 verses of Daniel 11. So Sister White's accurate, but it's more accurate to understand that the entire chapter plays out in verses 40 to 45. So if you go to Daniel chapter 11, just to do a little bit of review that I hope we understand. In verse 1 of chapter 11, it says, also in the first year of Darius the Mede, even I stood to confirm and strengthen him. Now, in chapter 10, going backwards, in chapter 10, verse 1, it says, in the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a thing was revealed unto Daniel. If you haven't been careful, you may have missed that the testimony of Daniel is that he only lived until the 1st year of the reign of Cyrus. If you go backwards now into verse 27 of chapter 6, it says, he delivereth and rescueth. This is when Daniel has been saved out of the lion's den. He delivereth and rescueth, and he worketh signs and wonders in heaven and in earth, who hath delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. Verse 28. So this Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. And that's the wrong verse, but somewhere it says that he continued until the first year of Cyrus. And I'm not going to take time to dig that out. I was thinking it was verse 28, but it's not. But the point is that the third year of Cyrus, in verse 1 of Daniel 10, is actually his first year, because his first 2 years he co-reigned with Darius. And Darius and Cyrus are the two waymarks that mark the time of the end. And the time of the end will always have two waymarks. The time of the end in the time of Moses was the birth of Aaron and the birth of Moses. Moses typified Christ, and the time of the end and the time of Christ was the birth of John the Baptist and the birth of Christ. The deadly wound, the 1798 time of the end, the beast that the papacy had rode on was delivered a deadly wound in 1798, and a year later, the woman that had been riding the beast died in exile in France. 1798, 1799 are the two waymarks for the time of the end in 1798. And Darius and Cyrus represent the time of the end in that particular history, and they're typifying the final time of the end in 1989, which is illustrated in verse 40. So in chapter 11, when the prophecy that Gabriel's laying out, interpreting for Daniel is set forth, its point of reference is 1989. And in 1989, you had two kings of the two-horned country. The two-horned country was the Medo-Persian Empire, and it typified the two-horned nation of the United States in 1989. And the two kings of the United States in 1989 were the two presidents, Ronald Reagan and George Bush the first. And they both were presidents during the year 1989. Bush took over at his inauguration. I suppose it was January 20th. So in verse 2, Gabriel says to Daniel, and now will I show thee the truth. Behold, there shall stand up yet three princes in Persia. So at that point, he's standing in the history of George Bush the first, and there's going to be three presidents that follow him, which would be Clinton, George Bush the second, and Obama. And the fourth shall be far richer than they all, and by his strength and through his riches he shall stir up all against the realm of Grecia. The realm of Grecia in end-time Bible prophecy is globalism. Globalism in the world and globalism in the political structure of the United States, represented by the Democrats and the rhinos of the Republican Party. They're globalists, and they all get stirred up by this sixth president, the fourth one after George Bush the first. And this word that is translated as stirred up means awaken. And in 2015, when Trump announced that he was going to run for president, the false awakening that precedes the true awakening of the 10 virgins was underway, and the globalists were stirred up. And for the next 4 years, they attempted to do everything they could to get rid of him, and finally they murdered him, the political horn of the earth beast, on November 4th, 2020, in the same year that the Protestant horn was eliminated on July 18th, 2020, because these two horns of the earth base, they go through history in a symbiotic relationship in terms of prophecy. But in verse 2, it stops there. It only takes you to this rich president, takes you to Trump 2015 to 2020, and then it jumps right into the United Nations with Alexander the Great standing up. So what I'm wanting you to see, the reason I'm taking a little bit of time on verse 2, is that this hidden history in verse 40 from 1989 until verse 41, the Sunday law, that's the portion of prophecy that relates to the last days that has been sealed up. And verse 2 of Daniel 11 unseals part of it because it takes you to 2015 when Trump announces that he's going to run for president. And it gives you a 5-year activity of Trump as he stirs up the globalists and they come after him with all their wokeism that they can muster. Then the narrative goes direct, doesn't carry on. It jumps to the New World Order, the United Nations, and the United Nations is going to be ultimately confronted with the four winds of Islam at the end of time. And Alexander the Great's kingdom gets divided into the four winds. And those four winds ultimately transcend into two empires that struggle with each other all the way through the rest of the book of the vision of Daniel 11, the king of the north and the king of the south. And in those illustrations, the history of verses 40 to 45 is repeatedly referenced. In verse 5, the king of the south is the king of Egypt, and Egypt is the dragon power, and he's strong, and one of his princes is strong above him and will have dominion. And the history of that is that as these generals fought to reestablish and take control of Alexander the Great's kingdom, Egypt gets established. Ptolemy establishes Egypt, and he has a superior general. And this general breaks away from him, Seleucus, and he now goes and he's going to conquer 3 geographical areas. And when he conquers that third one, he becomes the king of the north. And in the history of pagan Rome and papal Rome, Sister White, when commenting on pagan Rome in Revelation chapter 12, she says, the dragon in Revelation 12 is Satan, but in a secondary sense, it's pagan Rome. Pagan Rome was the dragon, and the dragon, Ezekiel tells us, the dragon is Egypt. The king of Egypt, the king of the south, that had a general that was strong, that broke away, was the dragon power. And sure enough, that general that breaks away, he establishes the empire of the kingdom of the north. And the kingdom of the north is going to become later on in history the papacy. And the papacy came out of pagan Rome. Pagan Rome disintegrated into 10 horns, and 3 of those horns had to be plucked up in order for the papacy to be established. And the relationship of the papacy coming out of pagan Rome has many, many prophetic attributes that need to be understood. But even here in the very beginning of this testimony, this first general that establishes the kingdom of the north in opposition to the king of the south, he came out from the king of the south, just as the papacy came out of pagan Rome. And rather than struggle, the king of the south made a peace treaty and offered the king of the north, Seleucus, his daughter, Egyptian princess, to seal the deal. And the king of the north married her, had a child with her, got tired of her, set her aside, and took back his original wife. And when his original wife had opportunity, she killed the king, she killed the Egyptian princess, her son, and her whole entourage. And that broken treaty inspired her brothers back in Egypt to mount an attack against the king of the north. And all of this is laid out in the book Daniel and Revelation by Uriah Smith. I'm reviewing it to make a point here, and I'm getting to the point right now. In verse 7, it says of Daniel 11, but out of the branch of her root shall one stand up in his estate, which shall come with an army, and shall enter into the fortress of the king of the north, and shall deal against him, and shall prevail. This word fortress is the key to the study that we're doing today. And here, when Ptolemy comes and seeks revenge for the broken treaty and his sister being slain by the king of the north, he goes all the way into Babylon, right into the throne room of Seleucus, and takes him captive, brings him back to Egypt. He dies in exile. He dies in exile by falling off a horse because he was the symbol of the papacy. The papacy was going to get taken captive by Napoleon, by his generals, and both the beast and the one riding on the beast were to be slain, because in Revelation 17, the whore of Rome rides upon the beast, and the beast are these 10 kings. And when Ptolemy brought Seleucus back to Egypt after he entered into his fortress, he first captured the fortress, then he brought the king back to Egypt, and he fell off his horse. Thus you see the symbolism of the beast that he's riding upon, and him both coming to their end, as was the case in 1798, when the political authority of the papacy was eliminated by Napoleon, and a year later the Pope died in captivity in 1799. The point I'm wanting you to see here is when the king of the south came in and retaliated for the broken treaty, both in the history of Ptolemy and the history of Napoleon, they both entered right into the fortress. Napoleon's general walked right into the Vatican and he captured the Pope. So that has a bearing, because ultimately the king of the north is going to retaliate against the king of the south, against the dragon power, against Egypt. And when it does, it happens in verse 10. And in verse 10 of Daniel 11 says, but his sons shall be stirred up and shall assemble a multitude of forces, and one shall certainly come and overflow and pass through. Then shall he return and be stirred up even to his fortress. He doesn't enter into the fortress, he just comes to the fortress. And where he came to in history, when Seleucus took back the geography that he had lost to the Ptolemies, to the king of the south, when they finally retaliated, he came to the borders of Egypt. The next battle is going to be at the border of Egypt, at Raphia, which is the borderline. And he came up to the fortress, and when he conquered this king of the south, he did so by overflowing and passing over. And if you look at your notes now, if you have notes, you'll find in verse 40, I have in the notes 1798 and 1989 as the marker for verse 40. When the United States, in conjunction with the papacy, swept away the Soviet Union in 1989, they overflowed and passed over. And this Hebrew expression of overflow and pass over is found in two other verses in the scriptures, and one of them is in verse 10, which we just read, when the king of the north retaliated against the king of the south, Ptolemy. In that history, he overflowed and passed through. It's the same Hebrew, but in verse 10, it's translated as overflow and pass through. And in verse 40 of Daniel 11, it's translated as overflow and pass over, but it's the same words. There's one other verse that has the same expression. You'll see it in your notes. It's Isaiah 8:8. And it says, then he shall pass through, he shall overflow and go over. It says it differently than the other two verses, but it's the same Hebrew in all three verses. And it says, he shall reach even to the neck. Okay, the neck being the borderline, we're going to show you, that is also referenced in verse 10 of Daniel 11. This expression, overflow and pass over, in these three verses, it might be difficult to make very many claims about them if you didn't have a second witness to the fact that these are all the same line of history. And the second witness is that in verse 7 or in verse 10 of Daniel 11 and verse 40 of Daniel 11 and verse 8 of Isaiah 8, where we find this expression overflow and pass through, they're all describing an attack upon the king of the south from the king of the north. So that gives you the context, a contextual support that this terminology overflow and pass over isn't simply coincidental, it's purposeful. In verse 10, Seleucus comes up to the border of Egypt and he overflows and pass over. And Seleucus is the king of the north and Ptolemy is the king of the south. In verse 40, the United States and the papacy are the king of the north, the United States being the proxy army of the papacy. And the Soviet Union is the king of the south. And when they sweep away and pass over the countries in verse 40, they leave Russia, which is the head, which is the capital, which is the fortress. It doesn't say it in the verse, but these other two verses, verse 10 and Isaiah 8:8, identify this fact, because when Sennacherib, the king of the north, came against Jerusalem in Isaiah 8:8, he came up to Jerusalem and he was going to take Jerusalem, but if you know the story, when Isaiah and Shebna and Hilkiah, or was it Hilkiah, when they were on the wall, the next morning, the whole army had been wiped out by an angel of the Lord. They never entered into Jerusalem. They came up to the neck. They came up to the border of the capital. The point about that is that these three verses, verses 10, verse 40, and Isaiah 8:8, are tied together because they're all illustrations of the king of the north coming against the king of the south. And two of those three verses specifically identify that the king of the north stops at the border, it stops at the fortress, it stops at the neck. And we would not be able to define that, perhaps, except that Isaiah 8:8 is a continuation of the prophecy that begins in Isaiah 7. And in Isaiah 7, verses 8 and 9, we have a definition of what the head is, what the fortress is. And I hope we understand that the head is what sets upon the neck. So when Sennacherib came up even to the neck, he came up to the head. But in Isaiah 7, 8, and 9, and brothers and sisters, now you really have to think this one through. You're on this verse is sacred ground. If you haven't studied the articles by Hiram Edson that were unfinished, but that came into the Review and Herald in 1856, where Hiram Edson was opening up the 7 times of Leviticus 26, you should. And when you study that, you'll find that the foundational point of reference for the light of the 7 times that the Lord was using Hiram Edson to bring forth in 1856 was these 2 verses here. And Isaiah 7, 8, and 9 identifies a 65-year period, a prophecy of 65 years, which marked the beginning of the 7 times judgment of 2,520 years against the northern kingdom of Israel and the beginning of the judgment against the southern kingdom of Judah. This 65 years is the starting point for both 7 times. And the time period between the northern kingdom being taken into captivity and the southern kingdom being taken into captivity is 46 years. So when they conclude later on in history, they produce the 46-year period from 1798 to 1844, which is the period of history when Jesus erected the Millerite temple, because any temple that gets erected in the scriptures is erected by Christ. So this verse here is profoundly important because in 1856, the Lord had wanted to seal the Millerite movement and finish the work, and they rebelled. In 1856, James and Ellen White both identified Adventism as being in a Laodicean condition, and at that point in time, the Lord opened up new light on the 7 times, and they rejected that light. And you know that they rejected it because they ceased the articles in 1856, and then in 1863, at the end of the 19 years of that 65 years, they came out with a counterfeit table of Habakkuk and removed the 2520 from that and began to produce articles denying the 7 times. The Lord had intended to accomplish the sealing of the Millerite movement from 1844 to 1863, but they rebelled. And when you look at that history, you can show that that rebellion of 1863 was illustrated by the rebellion at Kadesh, when the people accepted the report of the 10 spies and rejected the report of Joshua and Caleb. And in September 11th, 2001, the Lord returned his people to Kadesh for the 2nd time, and the sealing of the 144,000 began. And from September 11th, 2001 until the Sunday Law, the history of 1844 to 1863 is repeated. The first line identifies a rebellion. The second line identifies the obedience that produces the ensign of the 144,000. Nevertheless, the waymarks that exist from 1844 to 1863 align with the waymarks of our history from September 11th, 2001 into the Sunday Law. So that's just a touch of what's in verses 8 and 9 of Isaiah 7. My point being is, many points about this verse because it's profound. The very first truth that William Miller discovered was the 7 times. And the last truth that was opened up to the Millerites was the 7 times, and they rejected it and led themselves into wandering in the wilderness of Laodicea until they're spewed out of the mouth of the Lord at the Sunday Law. The first truth was the 7 times. The last truth was the 7 times. Correctly understood, the 2300-year prophecy was fulfilled on October 22nd, 1844, and so too was the 2520 prophecy of Judah, fulfilled on October 22nd, 1844. The 2300-year prophecy is associated with the law of God because the sanctuary was opened up, and the law of God references judgment. The 7 times references the trampling down of God's people. It's about mercy that's going to be offered to God's people, because judgment and mercy are going to kiss at this point in time in the sealing of the 144,000. And there's a trumpet that sounds when the 2300 years arrived on October 22nd, 1844. And it's a trumpet of judgment. It's the 7th trumpet. It's the 3rd woe. And Islam is the tool that the Lord uses as he executes his executive judgment. On October 22nd, 1844, in agreement with the outline in Leviticus 26, 25, and 26, when the Jubilee was to be celebrated, and the 7 times is a symbol of the Jubilee, they were to blow the Jubilee trumpet on the Day of Atonement. So on October 22nd, 1844, there were 2 trumpets. Maybe there was 1 trumpet that represents those 2 trumpets, or maybe there's 2 trumpets in union with one another. I'm not going to argue that point. But the one was the trumpet of judgment, and the other was the trumpet of deliverance for God's people, the trumpet that set the slaves free. That history is part of what is opened up with these 2 starting points of the 7 times here in Leviticus, in Isaiah 7, 8, and 9. And in Isaiah 7, 8, and 9, the reason I'm taking time on verses 8 and 9 of Isaiah 7 is because it's the same prophecy as Isaiah 8, 8. Okay, and to understand what it means that Sennacherib came up to Jerusalem, up to the neck and no further, you have to see the reference in verses 7 or in 8 and 9 of chapter 7. It says, for the head of Syria, Syria is a nation. The head of the nation is Damascus. Damascus is the capital city of that nation. For the head of Syria is Damascus, and the head of Damascus is Rezin. Rezin is the king. So it's saying a nation has a capital and it has a king, and they're all represented by the head. And it gives 2 witnesses to it in the very same verse. It says, and within 65 years shall Ephraim be broken, that it be not a people. And the head of Ephraim is Samaria. Ephraim is the northern kingdom of Israel. Samaria is the capital city. And the head of Samaria is Remaliah's son, the king of the northern kingdom at that time. So it's giving a definition of what the head symbolically represents. And then it says, if you will not believe, surely you shall not be established. And in 1856, Millerite Adventism didn't believe, and they weren't established. And they all die in the wilderness. There is no reference in the Bible in the spirit of prophecy of the Lord saving the Laodicean church, any more than there's a reference in the Bible of spirit of prophecy that any of the people that rebelled against Joshua and Caleb made it to the promised land. They all died in the wilderness. So if you will not believe what? Well, if you'll not believe the prophecy of the 65 years, and also upon 2 witnesses, if you won't believe the prophetic symbolism that a nation's head is its capital, and the head of the capital is its king. You got to believe that, because when you get to verse 8 of Isaiah 8, it says, he shall pass through Judah and shall overflow and go over, and shall reach even to the neck, and the stretching out of his wings shall fill the breadth of the land, O Emmanuel, Isaiah 8, 8. What I want you to see, if you will, in these 3 verses, Daniel 11:10, Daniel 11:40, and Isaiah 8, 8, you have a king of the north coming against the king of the south. Two of the three verses identify that the king of the north only comes to the border. It only comes to the wall of Jerusalem. It only comes to the border of Egypt. Upon the testimony of two, a thing is established. So even though it is not specifically identified in verse 40, it's saying that when the United States and the papacy swept away the Soviet Union in 1989, they left Russia standing, the head, the capital. And I don't think anyone denies that Russia was the capital of the Soviet Union. The other thing that is worth seeing here, in the context that Daniel understands both visions, the external and the internal vision, is that in two of these references of these three verses, the king of the north comes against the king of the south, and the king of the south in the two references are the dragon. They're either the literal dragon of Egypt in verse 10, or they're the spiritual dragon of atheism in verse 40. But the king of the north that comes against the king of the south in Isaiah 8:8, Sennacherib's the king of the north, but the capital that he's coming against is the capital that is Jerusalem. And Judah was the southern kingdom, and the capital of Judah was Jerusalem, and the throne was in the holy place. So both the external and the internal line of prophecy is represented by these three verses. You may not yet understand the implications of that, but I have pointed it out to you. And the reference in verse 9, or the statement that says, if you will not believe, surely you shall not be established. It's a clear echo of 2 Chronicles 20:20. It says, they rose early in the morning and went forth into the wilderness of Tekoa. And as they went forth, Jehoshaphat stood and said, hear, O Judah, ye inhabitants of Jerusalem, believe in the Lord your God, so shall you be established. Believe his prophets, so shall ye prosper. The wilderness of Tekoa that they're going into is the battle where Joshua dances into the battle and the Lord takes the enemy down. He marches in. It's a clear, positive parallel to the bringing down of Jericho as they marched around the city, and God brought the city down. The wilderness of Tekoa, Tekoa means the trumpet message that is sounded by the 144,000 at the end of the world is typified by the battle in the wilderness of Tekoa as carried out by Joshua, and as typified by, not as carried out by Jehoshaphat and typified by Joshua. I'm sorry. But as with Isaiah 7 verse 9, there's a prophetic challenge saying, so shall you be established if you believe the Lord your God, and if you believe his prophets, so shall you prosper. If you believe that the head of the nation is its capital and the head of the capital is the king, and you believe the 65-year prophecy, so shall you be established. But you're not going to be established on this truth until you see it in the last portion of the book of Daniel that relates to the last days, when that's unsealed. That's when you're going to see it, because it's sealed up to a specific point in time. When the time is at hand, you will see this truth, and if you believe, you will be benefited by it, and you will be among those who, with Jehoshaphat, and takes down the threefold enemy in his history, and with Joshua takes down Jericho, and who are lifted up as an ensign in the Sunday law crisis. And in Luke 24:25, Jesus said this, then he said unto them, O fools, and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. You go back and read that, and you'll find that it's a mild chastisement to his disciples for not believing the truth that he had been presenting to them all along, but he's giving them this mild rebuke at the very time that he's unsealing the truth after his resurrection. So there is a temptation when this final truth of Revelation is unsealed, which is the prophecy in Daniel that relates to the last days, to be slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. And to not believe it is to not be established. Okay, the king, Daniel 2:37-38, a king is the head of gold. Okay, let's have another word of prayer. Heavenly Father, as we take up our study again, we ask for your presence wherever we might be. Guide and direct our thoughts, our understanding, and let the words be clear. Let the internet connection stay strong. Keep any confusion out of what we're considering here. And we thank you for these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
In Daniel chapter 11, in verses 1 and 2, you can see 1989 until the first presidency of Trump. Trump comes into prophetic history, if you're going to mark it when he began his campaign in 2015, and then his being slain in the streets, 2020. And it ends there. The testimony from the book of Daniel ends. But that chunk of history from 1989 to 2020 can get overlaid in the blank area in verse 40. And once you understand that the fortress is the head, the capital of a nation, or the king of the nation, then you see that in verse 11, the king of the south is history. Egypt retaliate the king at the battle of Raphia. And Raphia was the borderline, and that borderline battle typifies the war Ukraine, Ukraine meaning borderline. It began in 2014. So if you take verse 11 and put it in terms of its end of time fulfillment, beginning in 2014, I know that Putin didn't invade Ukraine until 2022, but there was 8 years of conflict that preceded that. So what you have in verse 11 through 15 is you have two battles. You have other details. The first battle being the Battle of Raphia, historically, and the second being the Battle of Panium. But these are the second and third battle of three battles. Okay, the first battle was fulfilled in 1989, and with the collapse of the Soviet Union, even though there was bloodshed in that history, it was a Cold War. Therefore, the second and third battle are Cold War battles. And the Battle of Raphia, typifying the Battle of the Ukraine, is a Cold War battle with blood being spilled. And the Battle of Panium will be Trump's retaliation, Trump and the United Nations retaliation upon Russia for Russia's victory in the Ukraine. So without getting into the details, what I'm wanting you to see is that when Sister White says the portion of the, let me read it, the book that was sealed is not the revelation, but that portion of the prophecy of Daniel relating to the last days, the portion of Daniel relating to the last days that has been sealed until the time was at hand, was the blank area from 1989 in verse 40 until verse 41 in the Sunday law. And verse 2 gives you a line of prophecy from 1989 until 2020, and it speaks of Trump. And then verse 11 through 15 gives you these two battles that begin in 2014 and lead into the Sunday law. So without even knowing the specifics about what these verses represent, the logic is this is the portion of Daniel that was sealed until the last days, and therefore whatever these verses represent, they are the final unsealing of the revelation of Jesus Christ, which is to produce the combination of divinity with humanity. That is the establishing of the 144,000 and lifting them up as an ensign at the Sunday law. So that should provide some emphasis on these verses more than simply some interesting prophetic history. Because what it's saying is that we're now in the final hours of our probationary time. And Daniel, in verse 1, when he receives this vision of Daniel chapter 10, he says, in the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a thing was revealed unto Daniel, whose name was called Belteshazzar, and the thing was true, but the time appointed was long, and he understood the thing, and he had understanding of the vision. He's representing a people that understand both the external and internal vision. They understand both the 2300 year and the 2520 year prophecies, the 2520 being the external, the 2300 being the internal. And as such, when Gabriel's explaining, giving him the interpretation of the vision of Christ, which he has in chapter 10, Gabriel's interpretation is not identifying what the garments on Christ represent when he saw him in vision, or it's not the details of the actual view of Jesus Christ that humbled Daniel in the dust that Gabriel is explaining to Daniel. What he uses to explain the revelation of Jesus Christ that Daniel has had is this history of Daniel 11 from the beginning to the end. This is the revelation of Jesus Christ, but it possesses an internal and an external line of prophecy. So when we see that verse 11 of Daniel 11 marks the Battle of Raphia, and understand that to be the second Cold War battle, the battle in the Ukraine, and that it began in 2014, then it's marking that in that history, the next step in the sealing of the 144,000 began. The sealing began on September 11th, 2001, but it reaches a new point in its development in 2014. And then here in 2024, 10 years after the fact, Christ is now unsealing, the line of the tribe of Judah is now unsealing this hidden history of these verses that is the final step. And in Ezekiel 37, the message that awakens the dead, dry bones and gets them to stand on their feet is the message of the east wind, the message of Islam. But after Ezekiel presents that, then he gives another line that's supposed to be laid over the top of that illustration. It's a line of joining two sticks. And the two sticks, one was for the northern kingdom and one was for the southern kingdom. And they are both referenced in Isaiah 7, verses 8 and 9. Is it verses 8 and 9? Let me check. I think it is. Yes. And it sets forth the starting point of these two 25-20 time prophecies. And it's about God's people being trampled down. It's about many things, but one of the things is they're being trampled down by other human beings. It's about humanity being trampled down by sin. And in 1798, the first of those time prophecies came to a conclusion, and you reach the foundation of the temple of the Millerites, the starting point of raising up the Millerite temple, which was going to take 46 years, begin in 1798. And there is no other foundation that can be laid but Jesus Christ, so he's right there. And Jesus Christ is the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. When Jesus is at the foundation, he is the Lamb that is slain. And in the life of Jesus, there was 30 years of preparation, and then he was empowered and he gave his testimony for 3.5 years, and then he was slain. The Antichrist is governed by that same history. And there was 30 years of preparation for the Antichrist from 508 to 538. And then the Antichrist was empowered and he gave his testimony for 3.5 prophetic years, 1260 years. And in 1798, he was slain. 1798 is the time of the end, and it is a symbol of the slaying of the Lamb. Even though it's the papacy receiving the deadly wound, it's the same waymark. In 1798, you have the foundation of the temple, and the foundation is the Lamb, and the Lamb is slain from the foundation. The slaying of the Lamb, I know that we know this. Let me look through in my notes. I'm not going in order by the notes now. Now I'm going to just try to pull some things together. I have a quote in here where Sister White informs us that Christ's divinity did not die. It's impossible for divinity to die. But it was Christ's human flesh that died upon the cross. And this is, I need to find this. If you're not familiar with that, you're probably going to wonder why I'm saying that. Anyone find that in the notes besides me? Okay, it's the very last quote in the notes. I am the resurrection and life. He who had said, I lay down my life that I might take it again, came forth from the grave to life that was in himself. Humanity died, divinity did not die. In his divinity, Christ possessed the power to break the bonds of death. He declares that he has the life in himself to quicken whom he will. So on the cross, it was Christ's human nature that died. It was impossible for his divine nature to die. And his death marks the foundation of the temple. And that death is a waymark of 1798. And the symbol of the temple is the number 46. You have in your notes a reference where from Sister White that identifies Moses was 46 days in receiving the instruction on building the tent sanctuary. Herod's temple was 46 years in building. The human temple has 46 chromosomes, male and female, um, 23 male, 23 female, 23 being the symbol of the 2300-year prophecy. The 23 represents the Day of Atonement at 1 month, the combination. Okay, so 1798, you have the first 2520 ending, and a 2520 is about humanity. It's about the trampling down of humanity. And in 1798, you have the lamb that's slain. 46 years later, you have the other 2520, which is also about humanity. But that stick of Ezekiel, it's going to become one stick. And it's going to become one stick by also joining another stick. If we're treating the 2520 prophecies as two sticks, as we should in Ezekiel 37, they also get joined by the stick of the 2300 days on October 22nd, 1844. The 2520 that was upon the southern kingdom of Judah was upon the capital. Judah was the nation, Jerusalem was the capital, and the temple was the head, the throne room where the king sat. We have that in your notes, but I'm just gonna give you the overview now. So the two 2520s, they identify the raising of the temple. The one ends in 1798, and it's the lower nature, represents the lower nature of man, which Paul calls our flesh. The higher nature of man is our mind. The higher nature of man was represented by the 2520 against Judah. And the higher nature of man joins with the 2300-year prophecy on October 22nd, 1844. And it's at that point in time where the Lord intended to join the two sticks, where he intended to combine divinity with humanity, where he intended to raise up 144,000, but Millerite Adventism rebelled. What he is doing right now is he's joining the two sticks. The illustration of Ezekiel's two sticks shows that at the foundation of the temple in 1798, humanity had to die, but divinity wouldn't die. Divinity can't die. Divinity is the king that's in the throne room, and the throne room where he sits is the most holy place, which he entered into on October 22nd, 1844. In that throne room, he took the stick from the 2520 against Judah, and Judah was the capital. Jerusalem was the capital of Judah, and the holy mountain was the head. It was the citadel. The 2520 against the southern kingdom represents the higher nature of man. The 2520 against the northern kingdom represents the lower nature of man. And Ezekiel is describing how these two sticks are going to be joined, because he's first in Ezekiel 37 described that it's the message of Islam that's going to raise them up. And then he's going to describe about how humanity is divine, combined with divinity in the two sticks. And then he's going to reference the covenant, and that David is going to be their king forever, and that he's going to place his sanctuary in their midst forever. And that's where it all takes place. It takes place in the most holy place. Those that followed on in faith in 1844 into the most holy place were candidates to be among the 144,000 had they followed on by faith, but they didn't. That is being repeated in our history. The higher nature of man was to rule over the lower nature of man. That's the way we're designed. In the beginning, Adam and Eve's higher nature was an ascendancy over their lower nature. but at sin, it got turned upside down. That is why the lower nature of man is represented by the northern kingdom. It's not supposed to be the northern kingdom. It's supposed to be in the kingdom that's below. It's the lower nature. But because it's representing unconverted man, it becomes the northern kingdom in the prophetic scenario. The southern kingdom, where the capital is the higher nature of man that was to connect with the 2300-year prophecy. The two 2520s end and form the temple with the 46-year period of time. The first 2520, the human nature, it couldn't, the lower nature of the human nature, the flesh, it couldn't be transformed in the most holy place. So it died in 1798. It died on the cross, right where Christ's fleshly nature died, his human nature. But the higher nature, represented by the 2520 against Judah, it represented the mind. And we can have the mind of Christ at our conversion instantaneously. We can join with Christ in the most holy place, should we choose to do so. The joining of the two sticks, when it's the 2520s, is identifying the temple erection from 1798 to 1844. But the 2520, that is the Jubilee 2520 that came to 1844, it's also connected with the 2300 days. And the 2300-year prophecy that began in 457 began 220 years after the 2520 against Judah. And the number 220 is the symbol of the combination of humanity and divinity. And when those two sticks came together, the 2300 and the 2520 against the Southern Kingdom on October 22nd, 1844, they were to represent the sealing of God's people. And they're to represent that very same thing today. Now, in your notes, a couple more things that are worth noting. The lower nature of man, our flesh, that cannot be changed until the second coming. It's represented by the 2520 in the Northern Kingdom. And that particular time prophecy is divided into two parts, 1260 years and 1260 years. In the middle of those two parts is the cross of Christ, because that time prophecy parallels the week that Christ confirmed the covenant with many for a week. 1260 days, Christ gave his testimony, then he was crucified. Someone needs to mute their mic. 1260 years afterwards, or days afterwards, that his disciples witnessed for him. And has been pointed out before, at the crucifixion of Christ, that offering escaped the priest's hands, and from the time of Christ's baptism until that crucifixion, the 2520th lamb that was slain was Christ on the cross. The 2520 and the week that Christ confirmed the covenant are two parallel time prophecies, and they teach many, many things. And one of them is that it was Christ's humanity that died on the cross, not his divinity. And his humanity is in two parts, a higher nature and a lower nature. The lower nature cannot be transformed until the second coming. The higher nature can be transformed at conversion. We can receive the mind of Christ. The Northern Kingdom, representing our lower nature, was divided into two parts, and it represents two types of sin. We have sinful tendencies that have been transmitted to us through no act of our own from our forefathers, our mothers, fathers, grandfathers, all the way back to Adam, inherited tendencies to evil. But we also, unlike Christ, we have cultivated tendencies to evil. We've eaten evil things, drank evil things, did evil things before, and some of them have become habitual. We know those. There's two classifications for sin. Therefore, the 2520 that's representing the lower nature of man, our flesh, it's divided into two. And this is essential to understand. There are people that have not grasped the significance of this. Some used to follow this message and have lost their way by accepting the Catholic doctrine that Christ's fleshly nature was somehow different than ours. It was only different in the sense that he never sinned, but he accepted the inherited tendencies that came down through 4,000 years of sin to his birth. In your notes, you have a quote, probably, I don't have these, they're not page numbers, but it's from manuscript releases number 21, 406 and 407. The part of the quote that I emphasize, for years we've put this quote out in the public arena, and we always take it from Southern Watchman, I believe. But I'm taking this one from manuscript releases 21, page 406, 407, where the punchline is the same as in the quote in Southern Watchman, but the paragraphs that lead up to it are speaking more about the book of Daniel. So I'm going to read from this now, and I'm going to try to put an emphasis on the importance of understanding the incarnation. And the emphasis I'm going to try to put on it is that at the beginning of Adventism, when the most holy place was opened and Sister White went in, she saw that the Sabbath commandment had a soft halo. It shone above the other commandments. And this passage is going to talk about a doctrine at the end of time that God's students of prophecy will recognize that will shine above the other doctrines. So it's an illustration of Jesus illustrating the end from the beginning. And in doing so, he's identifying two connected but distinct doctrines. The one at the beginning being the Sabbath, and the one at the end being the incarnation of Christ. Man has nothing in himself wherein to glory. Tell it in clear, strong language. All he has is talent of reason, affection, speech, spiritual discernment, come to him through the mercy of the Son of the infinite God. These are to be surrendered to God again. Self-annihilation is a hard process, for self struggles for existence and dies hard. But prayer and faith place the weakest sinner on vantage ground, where the hand of faith can grasp firmly the hand of the Savior. In and through Christ, we may come off more than conquerors. God has given us instruction that every child of his has a work to do. To everyone is given talents according to his several ability. To minister for Christ is not necessary for a man to be a preacher. There are many who, though they do not feel that they have been set apart for a special work of preaching, are nevertheless ministering for Christ. The Son of Righteousness shines upon them, and they reveal that they are one with Christ. The Word of God is the man of their counsel, and they study the Scriptures. As they study the Scriptures, they are enabled to understand what they read. They work in unity with one another. There will be no discordant opinions among those who are taught by God. True saints are one in spirit and action. The Holy Spirit binds them together, and all the power of satanic agencies cannot break this union. The pure in heart shall see God. The impure cannot see him. All upon which they look is tarnished for them by their impurity. Those who search the scriptures with a heart which hungers and thirsts to know God and Jesus Christ will be rewarded. They will understand the words spoken to Daniel, that man of prayer. To Daniel, many wonderful things were presented in vision. I heard, but I understood not, he said. Then said I, O my Lord, what shall be the end of these things? The angel answered, and it quotes Daniel 12, 4, 10, and 13. The time had come for Daniel to stand in his lot. The time has come for the light given him to go to the world as never before. That's that portion of Daniel 11, verse 40, that has been hidden until recently. If those for whom God, the Lord, has done so much will walk in the light, their knowledge of Christ and the prophecies relating to him will be greatly increased as they near the close of this earth's history. Those who commune with God walk in the light of the Son of Righteousness. They do not dishonor their Redeemer by corrupting their way before God. Heavenly light shines upon them. They are of infinite worth in God's sight, for they are one with Christ. To them, the word of God is of surpassing beauty and loveliness. They see its importance. Truth is unfolded to them. Now, here's the punchline. The doctrine of the incarnation is invested with a soft radiance. They see that the scripture is the key which unlocks all mysteries and solves all difficulties. Those who have been unwilling to receive the light and walk in the light will not be able to understand the mystery of godliness, but those who have not hesitated to take up the cross and follow Jesus will see light in God's light. The doctrine of the incarnation, which is the mystery of godliness, which is Christ in you, the hope of glory, which is the combination of humanity with divinity, which Christ came to demonstrate and prove that divinity combined with humanity does not sin. That's why he came. That is what the incarnation is. It is the sealing of the 144,000, and it is the light that is unsealed in that portion of Daniel that relates to the last days. It's the joining of the two sticks. In the beginning of Adventism, the next quote says, I was amazed and saw the fourth commandment in the very center of the 10 precepts with a soft halo of light encircling it. Said the angel, it is the only one of the 10 which divines the living God who created the heavens and the earth and all things that are therein. When the foundations of the earth were laid, then was laid the foundations of the Sabbath also. At the beginning of the sealing process in 1844, which was turned away by rebellion, the Creator presented the light of the Sabbath. And that light was opened up at the end of the 2300-year prophecy. But the end of the 2300-year prophecy was also the end of the 2520-year prophecy. When an angel arrives, there's always an increase of knowledge that tests the people of that generation. On October 22nd, 1844, Millerite Adventism was scattered. And by 1849, Ellen White had said that the Lord was setting forth his hand to gather the remnant of his people that had been scattered. By 1850, they had produced the visual representation of the message they were going to use to go bring down the walls of Jericho in 1863. They began to fall away, and in 1856, they were identified as Laodicean, but the Lord then opened up the very light that he had opened up in 1844, the light of the 7 times, because it arrived there as well. And the light of the 7 times is the light of humanity. The light of the Sabbath is the light of the Creator. Those two prophecies are emphasizing the light at the beginning and the light at the ending. They're emphasizing the combination of humanity with divinity, which does not sin. It's what's happening right now in our history for those that'll see. In Desire of Ages, just going down through the notes now to pull this together. Desire of Ages 507, as the disciples searched the prophecies that testified of Christ, they were brought into fellowship with the deity and learned of him who had ascended to heaven to complete the work he had begun on earth. They recognized that in him dwelt knowledge which no human being, unaided by divine agency, could comprehend. They needed the help of him whom kings, prophets, and righteous men had foretold. With amazement, they read and reread the prophetic delineations of his character and work. How dimly had they comprehended the prophetic scriptures, how slow they had been in taking in the great truths which testified of Christ. Looking upon him in his humiliation as when he walked a man among men, they had not understood the mystery of his incarnation, the dual character of his nature. Their eyes were holden so that they did not recognize divinity in humanity. But after they were illuminated by the Holy Spirit, how they longed to see him again and place themselves at his feet. The dual nature of his character was the testimony of the combination of humanity and divinity that takes place with the 144,000 in the sealing process. In the next quote, which is from Acts of the Apostle, page 560, I'm going to pass over that first paragraph. It says, those who would gain the blessing of sanctification must first learn the meaning of self-sacrifice. The cross of Christ is the central pillar on which hangs the far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. The cross of Christ is the central pillar. And the rest of this quote is just profound. I should read it. But maybe I'll come back and read it. I'm going to jump to the next quote now and deal with this central pillar. Christian Experience and Teachings, page 25 and 26. Sister White's talking about when she was discouraged. I have a hunch that many people that are listening right now are having tremendous trials in their life. We may not fully realize that we are now in the final movements of the sealing of the 144,000, but Satan does. And he's watching the candidates for that group, and he's bringing pressure upon them. I guarantee it. I see it in my life, my son's life. Sister White was in a state of despondency. While in this state of despondency, I had a dream that made a deep impression upon my mind. I dreamed of seeing a temple to which many persons were flocking. Only those who took refuge in the temple would be saved when time should close. All who remained outside would be forever lost. Dropping down the next paragraph. Fearful of being ridiculed, I thought best to wait until the multitude dispersed or until I could enter unobserved by them. But the numbers increased instead of diminishing, and fearful of being too late, I hastily left my home and pressed through the crowd. In my anxiety to reach the temple, I did not notice or care for the throng that surrounded me. On entering the building, I saw the vast temple was supported by one immense pillar, and to this was tied a lamb all mangled and bleeding. We who were present seemed to know that this lamb had been torn and bruised on our account. All who entered the temple must come before it and confess their sins. Just before the lamb were elevated seats upon which sat a company looking very happy. Next paragraph. Even after I had entered the building, a fear came over me and a sense of shame that I must humble myself before these people. But I seemed compelled to move forward and was slowly making my way around the pillar in order to face the Lamb when the trumpet sounded and the temple shook. Shouts of triumph arose from the assembled saints, and awful brightness illuminated the building. Then all was intense darkness. The happy people had all disappeared with the brightness, and I was left alone in the silent horror of night. I awoke in agony of mind and could hardly convince myself that I had been dreaming. To be among 144,000 is to represent the character and the dual nature of Christ perfectly. It's to be a representative of the combination of humanity and divinity. That's why the promise in Revelation 3:12 and 13 says this: He that overcometh will I make a pillar in the temple of my God, and he shall go no more out, and I will write upon him the name of my God and the name of the city of my God, which is New Jerusalem, which comes down out of heaven from my God, and I will write upon him my new name. He that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit saith unto the churches. In the most holy place, I've passed over the notes to make this point just because of time, but I'm sure whenever I have opportunity to share again, I'm going to pass over these thoughts enough to get this settled in. The bringing together of divinity and humanity that is the sealing of the 144,000 takes place at the head, and the head is the throne room. It's the throne room of God. It's the most holy place. And in order to be there, our head has to be in agreement with the head in there. And the head in there is the mind of Christ, and we can have the mind of Christ. And when we have the mind of Christ, we become as Christ. We become a pillar in the temple, just like he's a pillar in the temple. And the pillar is the cross. And the pillar that Ellen White was hesitating to look at was a pillar that had the lamb that was slain from the foundation of the world. And it's interesting to consider what that pillar is, what the cross is. In the next quote, it says, we're to bear the yoke of Christ that we may be placed in complete union with him. Take my yoke upon you, he says, obey my requirements. But these requirements may be in direct opposition to the will and purposes of the human agent. What then is to be done? Hear what God says. If any man will come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. The yoke and the cross are symbols representing the same thing. The giving of the will to God. The giving up of the will to God. Wearing the yoke unites finite man in companionship with the dearly beloved Son of God. Lifting the cross cuts away self from the soul and places man where he learns how to bear Christ's burdens. The cross, which is the central pillar of the temple, is the will. It's our will that is exercised to crucify the lower nature. Our will can only be in agreement with God's will if we have his mind. If we have the mind of Christ, then our will is where we take our lower fleshly nature and crucify it daily, as Paul says. That was what was supposed to happen when the two sticks were joined in the Millerite history. That is what is happening as we speak now in our history. That wasn't the case for 100 and some years after 1863. We're now in the very final pressing down of the seal of God's people. And it's the prophecy that is laid between 1989 and the Sunday law in the book of Daniel that identifies this truth. Because when you identify the fortress as the head in verse 10 of Daniel 10 as Russia, you're identifying the external truth. But the external has an internal truth that runs with it. And when you're at the point in time where the Lion of the tribe of Judah has identified that Russia is the head and is repeating the war of Raphia in the war of the Ukraine, then you know that the parallel internal line is identifying that our head, our higher nature, must now be in the most holy place with Christ, with his mind. And if we overcome as he overcame, it's promised that we can set upon his throne as he sat down with his Father on his throne. And the throne room is where the king sits, and the king is the head of the capital city of the nation. That's what the Lord intended to do at the beginning of Adventism. That's what he's doing now. And it's this prophetic truth that he's unsealing and sending forth to the 7 churches that are scattered abroad in Asia that are identifying and emphasizing this fact. Philippians 2:5. Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. Passed over Romans 8. There's just so much put in place. I hope that you peruse these notes on your own time afterwards, but I'll answer some questions if I know how at this point.
Okay. Question. You mentioned earlier that Daniel only kind of lived shortly after Cyrus came to power there. And it was written in the chat, Daniel 1:21, where
Yeah, that was. Thank you.
where Daniel continued even unto the first year of King Cyrus. But then you go to Daniel 10:1. It reads, in the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a thing was revealed unto Daniel, whose name was called Belteshazzar. So
Yeah, what I was
yeah,
I went when I was playing that, I went to the wrong verse. You've identified the right verse. And the way that is understood is that Cyrus co-ruled with Darius for 2 years. And when Darius died, Cyrus became king all by himself. And that was his first year. That is the year that Daniel lived to.
okay.
But it was actually the 3rd year of Cyrus because he had the first 2 years co-ruled with the Darius. And the reason it's important to see that is it puts both Darius and Cyrus together as the time of the end, the same way that Ronald Reagan and George Bush the first are together for the time of the end in 1989.
Okay.
Are you understanding what I'm saying about the 7 times, what it's illustrating? No
Amen.
comment, huh?
Amen. Yes, we are.
I have a question. This is Ala. You've mentioned that, Raffia is, like a Cold War, but similar to the battle in 1989. Really wasn't a battle, but just the Cold War. But if you think about what's going on in Ukraine. I just kind of looked it up. They estimate that about 500,000 soldiers died on both sides, and there's a lot of civilians that died. So it really is not a Cold War. It's really vicious fighting. But I'm thinking maybe in the context that it's like a proxy war, so the armies of Rome are not really involved, but they're just supplying the weaponry, and it's just kind of localized in Ukraine. In that sense,
That's
maybe it's like a Cold War.
that's
Is that
exactly what I mean.
okay?
The three Cold Wars are essentially the papacy against communism, and the starting point for the modern papacy and for modern communism was 1917, 1918 with the Russian Revolution and the Fatima miracle. It gives direction to both of them, and they're in a war from that point on. So you can look at 1989 and you don't see much blood in that Cold War battle, but the reality of it is that some people say that when Stalin was ruling in Russia, there was more people put to death than Hitler ever put to death, and a good percentage of those were Catholics. There was blood that was flowing, but it was a proxy war that is carried out by the proxy armies of Catholicism. And the first proxy army in the first battle of what I'm calling the Cold War was the United States. The second is the Ukrainian government. And then the third one, the Battle of Panium, that's the United States again, because the first is going to illustrate the last. And there's blood spilled in all of them. I don't mean to be saying that isn't the case, but it's easy for me to see, I think easy for everyone to see, that it's NATO and the Western world that is going after Russia, and they're using Ukraine as the place to settle their differences. And in that sense, that's why I'm calling it a Cold War, but there may be a better term to put on it. But I realize there's lots of blood being spilled.
Jeff, okay, in regards to that statement that you had in the notes earlier about the doctrine of
The incarnate.
the incarnation having a goal, soft halo about it. I thought of this statement, and there's several like this. Considering the fact that the other statement in regarding the Sabbath, I forget exactly how it's worded, the one in regards to the Sabbath. I think it seems like maybe this statement and some similar to it kind of unites the two. The Sabbath is a golden clasp that unites God and his people. And then, let's see. Where did I? Oh, yeah. Okay. Here's, pardon me. Yeah, this other one here says, if they reverence the Sabbath, which is engraved on the first table of stone, they will keep the first three commandments, and the last six will reveal the duty of man to his fellow man. For the Sabbath is the covenant between God and man. It is the golden clasp which unites man and God in supreme obedience and reverence, and which unites man to his fellow man. So this uniting of man to God, the covenant, that's of course referring to the combination of divinity and humanity. But I just wanted to emphasize that it says that the Sabbath is the golden clasp which unites man to God. I'm not sure exactly how to understand all that, other than what it says on the surface there, but there seems to be some connection between that statement. These statements seem to kind of unite the two passages that refer to the Sabbath having a soft halo or something like that, and the doctrine of the incarnation of Christ having a soft halo.
Yeah, I agree with everything that you're saying and more. What the point that I was trying to convey and probably didn't do too well, I'm running out of steam here, is that everything that you're saying is correct, as far as I understand it. The Sabbath being a symbol of the combination of divinity and humanity is without a doubt. But I was trying to emphasize that the 2,300 years lead you first to the law of God, it leads you to the Sabbath. And I'm understanding the 2,300 year prophecy as a prophecy of divinity. And that the 2520 is the prophecy of humanity. And the capstone of the prophecy in the Millerite history, the first thing Miller discovered was the 2520. The last thing that the line of the tribe of Judah tried to open up to them was the 2520. So here at the end of the world, it's all about the combination of divinity and humanity. But once again, it's the 7 times the line of humanity that opens up all this light. It's the light of Revelation, the bright light of Revelation 11, the 2 witnesses coming to life, and then being able to see Daniel's 2 prayers in Daniel chapter 2 and Daniel chapter 9. The one prayer is to understand prophetic history. The other prayer is to have the experience of the 7 times. That light, they go together. The Sabbath is the creator. The 7 times is the creation. It's so profound that there's no way, at least me, I can't express it well enough to convey the depth. So I'm not in denial with anything you said. That lays right over the top. But I was just trying to make the point that the 7 times at one level is the prophecy of humanity. The 2,300 is the prophecy of divinity, and they have to come together. And they're there at the beginning. They're there at the ending.
Yeah, I was just trying to mention these statements as a complement to what you were saying. That's all.
Yeah, I know you did.
If I can add another compliment to it and maybe ask a question too. It seems like obviously from the Garden of Eden, we have the 2 institutions, Sabbath and marriage. And in the same context of what you both are speaking about, marriage is obviously the covenant between the man's covenant, man and his wife, right? Husband and wife. And then Sabbath is the marriage covenant, in a sense, the marriage covenant between God and humanity, when he creates a day for us to rest, and that divinity and humanity can spend time together or develop a relationship. So I think the Sabbath has always been a seal or a sign of that covenant, that relationship between divinity and humanity. So that ties into maybe the 2520 leading to 2,300 years going into the Sabbath commandment in the sanctuary, and also something of the breaking down of the institution of marriage since the Garden of Eden when Adam and Eve was scattered. Just laying that on the table.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, it fits. Correct.
Larry, you had your hand up. Did you have a question?
Yeah. Just want to say thanks for sharing your thoughts, Jeff. And I had a question in regards to when you were talking about the overflowing and the passing through. I've always associated those verses also with Revelation 12:15 and the flood, and then how that ties to Revelation 13 in association with the wilderness time period and all that, and how that leads up to the image of the beast and apostate Protestantism's role in that. Do you have any insights with the way you're connecting this together with apostate Protestantism and its role in making this image to the beast. And I also wanted to say, I also appreciate that you have brought in the nature of Christ and the nature of man into the prophetic narrative and how you tied those together. I appreciate that too. So thank you for that.
I deal with in the articles, and I understand that the flood in Revelation 12 is the persecution of Rome against God's people, and that the earth opens its mouth and swallows up the flood. And I believe that was the Constitution, because it's through the mouth that you speak, and the characteristic of the United States is the speaking of the nation. And when you get to verse 11 of Revelation 13, then the United States is speaking as a dragon, and therefore it's opening up a flood. I never treat it that way, but I mean, there's a logic there that that's where the persecution is going to reinitiate. But for me, those three phrases are more the connecting links to open up what the Battle of Raphia and Panium represent here at the end. I mean, we've understood the Battle of 1989 for quite some time. For those people that wanted to see it, hasn't been a secret. And we've had some insights to Raphia and Panium, but I don't ever think that we've really laid that line over that hidden area in verse 40 of Daniel 11. And there's still the rest of Daniel 11 to put on that hidden area. There's still more to say. But when we do it now, I think it demands that we understand that the part that's amazing to me is when Daniel sees the vision in Daniel chapter 10, he's giving another line that goes right over the top of Revelation 11. It's given a sequence of events that leads to the sealing of God's people and the lifting up as an ensign. His three touches they have certain places where he's touched three times where they're in this sequence of the sealing of the 144,000. But what amazes me is the vision that he sees is the vision of Christ, this looking glass vision. And when Gabriel's going to give him the interpretation, it's the prophetic history of the struggle between the king of the north and the king of the south. How is that a vision of the glorified Christ? Okay, but it is. I'm not doubting or questioning. I'm raising that to provoke thought. The vision of the struggle between the king of the north and the king of the south is the vision of Christ, and Christ came to teach that divinity and humanity combined does not sin. So we have to see that thread of truth in this prophecy of Daniel if we're going to see it correctly. And when we do, it turns on lights in the prophetic word that have never been seen before, or at least I sure haven't seen them. These truths.
Elder Jeff?
Yes.
I just had a thought to further your idea on the unity, but I wanted to share my calculator. So I'm just going to put it on the screen and then we can see my calculator. Okay. So right now we know it's 2024, and you had been talking about 1863. So we take 2024 minus 1863. Does anyone know what we get?
You do.
So 20. A 161. And I'm going to call on Sister Bonnie. I'm hoping you remember what this symbol meant, what the symbol is, Sister Bonnie. But anybody else, if they remember, but I'm calling on Sister Bonnie here.
Is it dumb dog? Is it?
That's 483.
Oh, that's
So
483.
161. What was the 161 as a symbol?
I'm gonna need someone to help me with that.
A
Terrible name.
lifeline. Okay. Well, we talked about it a couple times. So, but that's okay. But I'm basing this off of a few reasons. But the main reason, I'll give the hint, is in the strong. So if you go to the strong, so if anybody has strong, and you look in the Hebrew for 161, so I guess I'll just pull it up. So we'll see who gets there first. So can you see the screen?
Yep.
So what was that? We talked about this a couple times, Sister Bonnie, but I'm going to forgive
Ehud.
you. We talked a
Ohad,
lot.
Ehud.
We talked a lot about it. But I'm just referencing the 161 here because it also
That's
pops
the
up
League
with
of Rome.
Islam.
That's the
It'll
League of
pop up
Rome.
with the League of Rome.
That's the League with Rome.
Well, that was in
161.
168. I think 168 plays in there too on the 1843 chart. You can see the number 168. But maybe the League of Rome, you could explain that further, the 161. But I thought it was 168 on the chart.
That was the BC's Jews with the League with Rome.
Okay. Would you like to elaborate?
I can't. That's just in my notes.
Okay. Okay. So my point here was what Elder Jeff was saying earlier about the two stakes joining in unity. But and then I'm going to show you something how the 161 can relate to Islam. But I'm going to just show that in a second. But what I wanted to just give as a second witness for what Elder Jeff was saying about the Ehud character here, Ehud is symbol for unity. So in the Hebrew, it's a 161. But I'm going to show you the calculator now. Is there another reference for this tying into Islam?
Can I interrupt? Jeff has to go soon. He said he was tired. So can we just finish up with whatever questions we have with him? Then you can come back and show us this. So I know Paul had his hand raised with a question.
Hello, greetings, Elder Jeff. Thank you for being able to present. Praise the Lord. And happy Sabbath as well. You mentioned earlier 2014, there was a battle, and I don't know if I got that correctly or anybody else got that. The 2014 year, that particular year, just kind of stood out to me, to myself. And it just kind of reminded me of the 2014 that took place in the movement. So there was a 2014 event externally, and there was a 2014 internally. I don't know if you can actually kind of connect those two together. If I'm following the right line of thought there. Thank you.
You may be correct, but all I'm identifying is that the people in the world today say that the war in the Ukraine started in 2014, but I wasn't making any application about the movement of Future for America in 2014. I don't know. I don't remember off the top of my head what happened in 2014.
Thank you. In the movement, there was a prediction being made that there's going to be a Sunday law, I believe, if I recall correctly.
You're saying that's when Tessa's information arrived? No?
Yes, yeah. That was the internal kind of.
But that could very well be. The thing about that is that you're getting into even just to explain myself. When I started writing these articles, my motivation was I'm going to write down what I've came to understand after the disappointment, and I'm going to do it so it's in the public record. And this feeling I had that I needed to write would be removed from me, so I'd have my responsibility taken care of. But once I started writing, then I realized I was being directed in where I was supposed to write and what I was supposed to write about. And I haven't went back and looked at that stuff at all what went on back there. But that makes sense to me if that's when Parminder and Tess actually started their nonsense, because that would be the same period where the globalists got riled up by Trump in 2015. And, this was an attack from the beast of Revelation 11, which is the beast of atheism. And it was wokeism politically for Trump and wokeism religiously for the movement. So if it actually started in 2014, that would be interesting. But I haven't looked at any of that. And I'm not gonna look at any of it. The thing until I get done, I feel like I'm almost done with Daniel. I'm done, and until I get done, I'm not going to do anything but get done. Be done.
So
Amen.
sorry to bring that back up again. Thank you.
Not a problem. Good to hear your voice.
You too.
Happy Sabbath, Jeff.
Happy
Nana Henry had a question as well. Jeff, whenever you feel you want to end the discussion, just let us know, because I'm sure we could go forever.
Yeah, I need to go. I'm feeling kind of weak. I had a dental procedure that gave me a sinus headache big time, and I'm feeling beat. And I wouldn't mind, coming back again, and because I'm not even close to getting through all this, but it's been a real privilege to share. If I have a warning to give, it's that I'm certain that this is the message that's being unsealed by the Lion of the tribe of Judah. This is the message that is the revelation of Jesus Christ. And all the illustrations of this final warning message that are recorded in sacred scripture apply now. And the one of them that was the first one on the notes today is that we're doing the work of Nehemiah, and there's going to be enemies from within that try to distract, discourage, attack. And we need to have the spirit of Nehemiah and just close those doors. Don't allow them to get up on the wall with us.
Brother Jeff,
Time is
this
too
is
short.
this is Steve. Would you like to speak next week?
Yeah, I don't have a problem with that.
Amen.
Okay. You're
So
on the American
that means
Zoom next week.
out loud, and I'll take up my stuff next Sabbath. Really.
Okay.
Thank you, Elder Jeff. Thank you very much. Happy Sabbath.
Sabbath.
God bless.
Amen. Feel better.
Thank you.